In nymphing, the lighter you go, the better the presentation you can make. Lighter leaders mean less sag affecting your drifts. Lighter tippets mean less surface area, less drag, and faster sink rates. And lighter flies drift more naturally and result in more takes, especially when the fish are picky. Though light rigs are great, they can be hard to cast. With these systems, the traditional overhead or oval casts become less effective because the air resistance starts to overcome the energy you can put into the leader and fly. Those casts still come into play, of course, but more often than not, we turn to water load casts, or as some may know it, the Frisbee Cast, as a way to add more energy to the system without upping the weight of the fly or the size of the leader. Today, we're going to learn how this cast is done. Water loading is basically when we utilize the resistance of the fly and leader on the water in addition to their weight to load the rod and send our fly towards its target. It allows you to make some really far casts with very light flies because you no longer have to rely on just the weight of the system to load the rod. It may sound pretty simple, but there's actually a lot going on with it. So the water load cast has two parts: the setup, which is what's going to determine the direction your fly goes, and the delivery, the actual cast. A little disclaimer is that this cast is very well tuned for a single fly on a micro leader system. As you start getting into heavier leaders, kind of above that 8-pound mark, the dynamics of the cast change a little bit as the weight of the leader approaches and exceeds the weight of your fly. The cast is still going to work well for heavier leader systems, but you're going to have to modify it a little bit to get the most out of it and make sure you're not overpowering your system. Getting into the actual cast, we're going to start by looking at the setup. And I'm going to break the setup down into two kind of subparts. The first is going to be the fly setup, and the second is going to be the rod setup. So starting with the fly setup, it's often overlooked by anglers, but it's actually one of the most important parts of the cast because it's going to determine where your fly is going to travel to. There's something called the 180-degree rule. This says that the fly is going to end up landing in a spot pretty much 180 degrees through the rod tip from where it started, no matter what you do during the cast. This is because as soon as the fly leaves the water, it already has momentum pointing it towards the rod tip. Once the fly is out of the water, there's no more tension on it, and with a very light, supple leader and some slack from the fly shooting towards you, it's hard to transmit enough force to the fly to alter its direction. In less complicated terms, the fly wants to travel in a direction straight through the rod tip from where it started, and even if you make a cast off of that line, you're going to have a really hard time changing where it wants to go. With that in mind, it should make sense why it's important to put some thought into where your fly is starting out the cast. You should choose a target behind you, just like you would choose a target in front of you where you want your fly to go. One of the biggest roadblocks I see with people who are first learning this cast is a reluctance to actually look behind them when they're setting it up. Now, when you get a little bit more of an intuitive feel for where your fly is, you can, blind cast back and then come into your forward cast. But especially as you're learning, it really helps to turn around, choose a target, make a good cast towards it to get the fly there, and then come into your actual cast. Even the best anglers are looking behind them and setting it up some portion of the time, especially in tougher water. So definitely keep that in mind. And if you're having trouble getting your fly to the target, look behind you and maybe try and set your cast up a little bit better. One very important thing to remember when setting up your cast is that the water behind you is often moving. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, but no matter what, you're going to have to compensate for that movement when you're first setting your fly back there so that it's in the right position to make the cast you want by the time you actually make your cast. So with this water moving like it is behind me, if I want to make a cast about 45 degrees up, I'm going to have to cast pretty much straight behind me, come into the cast, and then cast forward. And I get that nice kind of 45-degree angle. If I start with my cast below me and then try and cast at that 45 degrees, the fly is going to go a lot more upstream than I was expecting instead of out towards the bank. This is very situational, especially in rivers with a lot of pockets and different conflicting currents. You're going to have to do some experimentation with where your fly gets set up, and sometimes it might take you 2 or 3 tries to get it towards the target. But keep that in mind, because if you don't, then you're going to have a very hard time being accurate. You should be thinking about those fundamentals when you're setting your cast up, but now I'm going to show you a little bit of a cheat code to figure out which direction your fly wants to go. And you may have already thought of this on your own, but if you take a look at what direction that leader is pointing through your tip once your fly is on the water, it's going to show you the exact direction your fly is going to want to go once you start the cast. So if you set your cast up and that leader isn't pointing in the direction of your target, you know that you need to adjust something to get your fly to go where you want it. Now we're going to move on to the rod setup. So the rod setup is going to determine the upward angle of your cast and the arc of travel of the fly, which is going to dictate how much slack you can get into the presentation, how far it's going to go, and how much power and efficiency you're going to get out of your cast. So with a water load cast, you always have to have at least a little bit of an upward trajectory for your fly. Without that, your fly or your rod tip is going to crash into the water and you're not going to be able to get it to where you want it to go. When I'm talking about trajectory, I'm referring to the angle between the leader and the water's surface. Basically, how much that leader is pointing up off the water towards the sky. If we go back to the 180-degree rule, it applies in the vertical plane just as much as it does the horizontal plane. So that fly is going to want to travel on whatever path that leader lays out for it through the rod tip. For that reason, we usually want to start this cast a little bit lower. I have a lot of clients who want to start out with the rod tip high like this, but as you can see, that leader is pointing a lot more up than it is out. And you're going to struggle to be able to get the distance you want out of that cast because your fly is going to be going more vertical. I usually start with the rod around the chest height or a little bit lower, and as you can see, that 30-degree angle is going to send that fly a lot more upstream than it is up into the sky. The other thing this upward leader angle is going to determine is how much slack I can get out of the presentation. With a shallower angle, everything is going to lay out flatter, there's not going to be a lot of slack, and the fly is going to sink slower. With a steeper angle, everything's going to stop shorter, the fly is going to fall below the rod tip, and we're going to get a lot of slack and a faster sink rate out of the fly. By modifying this angle, you can control the amount of slack and control how fast your fly sinks. The final thing we want to look at in the rod setup is the starting position of the tip. If we look at that angle between the leader and the rod, if that's 90 degrees or less at the start of the cast, we're going to have a very hard time maintaining a rod path along the trajectory that fly wants to take because our casting stroke is an arc, not a straight line. We need to open that angle up a little bit to a little greater than 90, usually by cocking the wrist back, so that the starting and ending position of the rod tip are on that path that the fly wants to take. And that way, we're going to be able to get a much more efficient and much more accurate cast. Now that you have the fly and rod set up, it's time to come into the actual cast. The first thing to remember about the delivery is that you want to be squared up with your target before you come into the actual casting stroke. I have a lot of clients get everything set up and then make that cast before they're finished turning. All that does is moves the rod tip out of the path of travel of that leader and fly, takes the straight line nature of that cast away, and takes the accuracy and power out of your cast. What you want to do is get set up, stick the turn, and then come into your casting stroke. The number one mistake I see with any nymphing cast is people bringing the rod through too exaggerated of a casting stroke. I see a lot of casts that look something like this, with a long stroke that sends the fly either way up and around or way out and around the rod tip. Intuitively, it does make sense that a longer casting stroke is going to generate more power and allow you to get the fly further. In reality, it's actually a little different because, as we were talking about earlier, we want to try and keep the rod tip tracking along the straight line path our fly wants to travel. As soon as we start making longer and longer casting strokes, the rod tip starts arcing more and deviating from that path. And what that's going to do is pull slack out of the system as you start pulling your leader to the side of its path of travel, as well as pull power from the system as you start pulling it backwards a little bit. And it's going to create more drag as you increase the cross-sectional area of your system. So what we actually want to do is use a very short condensed casting stroke, something like this, that's going to keep that tip tracking along that path of travel to the maximum that we can. But let's take a look at the mechanics of this cast a little bit more in depth. As you can probably see, it's a very wrist-centered cast. I'm not using any shoulder involvement, very little forearm involvement, mainly just on that back cast to try and pick up some slack, but on the forward cast, it is mainly wrist. And that's because the muscles in our wrist, we can generate a lot of acceleration very easily without increasing the arc length of that tip very much. So keeping in the wrist, there is no other body involvement. I'm not shrugging towards the cast, not turning my waist with the cast, just squaring up to the target and flicking that wrist towards it. Now, I'm holding the rod with a grip that I like. You can do this cast with pretty much any grip you prefer. I prefer now to push or pull with my forefinger, but you can make the same cast with your thumb on top. It just depends what you're more comfortable with. One thing that you may have noticed or been wondering is that if we're trying to track the path our fly is going to take as close as we can with the rod tip, then the fly should be crashing into the tip after we stop the cast. And that is true, but there are 3 things we can do to avoid this. The first is to send the fly out and around the rod tip, which is my least favorite option because it makes it a little bit harder to maintain accuracy. The 2 ways that I like to do it are to either send the fly directly below the rod tip on the cast or directly above the rod tip on the cast. And that's a more accurate way to do it because all you're doing is changing the level of the fly and not its horizontal position. Now, bear with me because it may be a little confusing at how I explain this, but it should be pretty intuitive when you actually try it. The way to send the fly below your rod tip is to angle your casting vector slightly higher than the angle that your leader creates with the water. What this is going to do is move your rod slightly above the path of the fly on the cast, and when you stop, your rod is going to be higher than the fly is traveling. Something just like that. The way to send the fly above the rod tip is to angle your casting vector slightly below that leader angle with the water. And that's going to move your rod a little bit more horizontally, and it's never going to cross the path your fly is going to take. So that's going to look something like this. And it may sound a little bit confusing, but it is very intuitive. Most people can figure it out in just a couple minutes of playing around with it on the water. All you're doing is just moving your rod either past that plane of travel or making sure you never hit that plane of travel. I know that was a lot of information and probably a little bit more technical than most people prefer to go, but I think those are all really important concepts to know as opposed to me just showing you the cast so that you can actually go out and troubleshoot it on your own and adapt it to different situations and scenarios. But right now, we're going to put it all together in a way that I hope kind of ties it pretty well. I'm going to target this water kind of straight up ahead of me, about 30 degrees or so. To do that, I need to set the fly up pretty much downstream, but slightly behind me. We have some walking pace, a little bit faster water that's moving pretty much directly downstream of me. So I'm going to have to compensate a little bit for that movement by setting the fly a little bit further back and higher than when I want it on the delivery. And then I'm going to turn, square up with the target. I'm going to stop moving my hips. I'm going to set the rod up so that we have somewhere around a 30-degree angle because we don't need too much slack to get down in this relatively shallow water. Cock that wrist back just a little bit, and then I'm going to drive the rod forward using the wrist through my forefinger, making a very short, powerful cast with a hard stop so that I can transfer energy efficiently to the fly. And I'm going to stick the landing on that cast so that all that energy can flow through the leader, out the fly, and everything can lay out nice and straight. So in real time, it's going to look something like this. Just like that. It's a very short stroke, but it's very powerful. You can see that leader kicking as the energy dissipates at the end of the cast. Just like that. If you're doing that right, then you should be feeling a slight pop or tug at the end of your cast, which is that system straightening out and all the energy dissipating through the fly before it falls to the water. That's kind of the thought process and factors that I run through when I'm making water load casts, and adjusting them to different conditions and situations and rigging systems. As I said in the beginning of the video, this works really well for a lighter single fly on a microliter. As you go up in fly weight, then it becomes a little bit different. You have to compensate for that extra load and kind of tone down the acceleration of your wrist, or else you might get some weird bounce back and lose a little bit of accuracy. If you go to a two fly system, it becomes even a little bit more difficult because now you have more weight as well as 2 point masses that both want to follow the 180-degree roll from their own starting position. So you get a lot more kind of twirling in the air and run the higher risk of running into your rod tip. Kind of adjust for that, you want to take your casting vector just a little bit more above or below that plane of travel to get the rod tip out of the way, or even go to a little bit more of a traditional ovalized cast. So, hope you guys learned a little bit from this video. I know as I was learning this stuff piece by piece, it all really helped increase my catch rate and efficiency on the water. So hopefully this shortens your learning curve a bit. And if you would like to learn a little bit more in person, you can always book a guide trip at innovativeangling.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe.